Hello, and welcome to this NSCA-approved CEU learning modules presented by Fitness for Professionals. Today we're going to cover sports nutrition recommendations, and I'm your host, Paul Moore. Today, the objectives are to learn about general nutrition and provide us with an overview, go over some sports nutrition guidelines, and then talk about some of the application of these guidelines. As we start with a general overview, we know we have 6 essential nutrients: proteins, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water. We consume each of these nutrients in combinations of food or in the beverages that we drink. It is rare that we only consume one nutrient at a time through food. However, we can consume one single nutrient through supplement, but generally we do consume these in the foods that we eat and beverages that we drink. There are several ways that we can classify these nutrients. You can see from the chart, protein, carbohydrates, and fat are all considered macronutrients. They are considered macronutrients because we need them in large amounts in our diet. We need them in large amounts compared to the 2 micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. And you can see that vitamins and minerals are considered the micronutrients, again because we need those in small amounts in our body. So we have the 3 macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, and fat, and then we have the 2 micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. Also looking at the chart, you can see that we have a classification called energy yielding nutrients. And you can see that these nutrients include the macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, and fat. You can also notice from the chart that they are considered energy yielding because they provide us with calories that our body can then convert and use for energy. In looking at the chart, you can see that protein has 4 calories for every gram. Carbohydrate also has 4 calories for every gram, and fat has 9 calories per gram. So for protein and carbohydrate, 1 gram of either of those nutrients equals 4 calories. 1 gram of fat is equal to 9 calories. You will notice that our micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, as well as water, have no calories. Therefore, they are not considered energy yielding. While vitamins and minerals may help regulate the processes that turn macronutrients into a usable form of energy, they themselves do not provide energy because they do not have calories. In looking in this chart, you can see that we cover the nutrients, the 6 essential nutrients: protein, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water. And we'll talk about each of the sources of those, the functions of those, if we store those and how, and then any calorie information and recommendations for each of those. So for example, if we start with protein, you can see the sources of where we get protein from in the diet. We get protein from meats and beans, dairy, and nuts. The primary function that we think about with protein is that it helps with our muscle health. Proteins do serve other functions in the body, but generally the function that we think of is that of muscle health. Another good general recommendation or rule of thumb is that for protein, we think that it functions with anything that has to do with growth, repair, maintenance of tissues of the body. So when we think about growth and development, we think about repair from damage, for example, from strength training, we understand and realize that protein has a role in that process. As far as storage of protein, we do not store any protein like we do the other nutrients. Protein is not stored, but it can be used and put into an amino acid pool in the body, of which can be drawn out to use for other things. We do move protein for structural purposes in the body. So for example, if we do that strength training workout that causes damage to the muscle fibers, our body can use protein to help build that muscle fiber back up. However, it is not stored at that point. It is considered structural at that point. So there is no storage compound specialized for protein. The recommendation for protein, the AMDR stands for Acceptable Macronutrient Distribution Range, for protein is 10 to 35% of calories. So that would be the recommendation for the average individual. 10 to 35% of total calories in a day should come from protein. We will look toward the end of this lecture at the sport nutrition recommendation for protein and how it differs from this AMDR recommendation. Moving to carbohydrate, we can see the sources in the diet include grains, fruits, vegetables, milk, bread, pasta, rice, cereals. All are good sources of carbohydrate. The primary function for carbohydrate in the body is for energy. For storage of carbohydrate, the body can store carbohydrate as a compound called glycogen. So glycogen is stored glucose or stored carbohydrate and can be done in two places in the body. Our bodies can store carbohydrate or glycogen in the muscle, known as muscle glycogen, or it can be stored in the liver, known as liver glycogen. However, both of these glycogen stores can be maxed out. So there's a certain amount of glycogen that we can store in the muscle and a certain amount of glycogen that we can store in the liver. We use muscle glycogen for physical activity and exercise for fuel for our bodies. Liver glycogen is used to help regulate blood sugar. The AMDR for carbohydrate is 45 to 65% of total calories in a day. So again, for the average individual, 45 to 65% of their daily calories should come from carbohydrates based on this recommendation. Moving along to the last macronutrient, fat or lipids, you can see that we can get our lipids from nuts, oils, from processed foods, from refined foods. There are a couple functions here that we want to talk about. Number one is that we can use fat as an energy source. And you remember from the previous slide that it does contain 9 calories for every gram. Also functioning with fat is that we do want to help absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. So there's 4 fat-soluble vitamins, and we have to have some fat in the diet to help absorb those properly. So fat will function in that process as well. The last function of fat listed in this presentation is to consume the essential fatty acids. We've heard of the benefits of omega-3 fatty acids, for example, and so to be able to consume those nutrients, we have to consume fat in the diet. We do store fat in the body as lipids. What's different about storage from fat and compared to carbohydrate is that we can store an unlimited or limitless amount of fat in the body. So with carbohydrate, we have a limited storage capacity. For fat, we have an unlimited storage capacity. And for protein, we don't store it. So that's an important distinction between those 3 nutrients. For the recommendation for fat, you can see that the AMDR is 20 to 35% of total calories. So in the course of a day, roughly 20 to 35% of our total calories should come from fat sources. Moving along to our micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals, you can see that for sources for both of those, they really are various. We can get some from fruits, from vegetables, from dairy. So it really is individual to the nutrient and to the food source. The functions vary widely as well, depending on which vitamin or mineral we're discussing. So for example, we have several vitamins and a couple of minerals that act as antioxidants. We have several of the B complex vitamins that can help in the energy production pathway. We have minerals like calcium that are good for bone health. And so the functions vary tremendously based on which nutrient we're discussing. For storage, that is going to vary as well with the nutrient. However, for the vitamins, we have 2 types of vitamins. We have fat-soluble vitamins and we have water-soluble vitamins. The fat-soluble vitamins can be stored when we consume them in excess. However, with the water-soluble vitamins, our body will generally try to get rid of the excess. So we have little storage of those water-soluble vitamins compared to the storage that we can have with fat-soluble vitamins. Also for the recommendations here, we know that both vitamins and minerals contain no calories, so they give us no energy. However, the recommendations again will vary widely and be based on the specific nutrient that we're talking about. So calcium will have one recommendation and thiamine will have another recommendation. So if you're interested in those, feel free to check out those values that you can find listed. I hope that was a helpful overview for sources, functions, storage, and recommendations for both the macronutrients and for the micronutrients. Now let's move on in practice. So let's think about the calories. Let's convert for carbohydrate and protein, the number of grams to calories for each of the nutrients for carbohydrate and protein, as well as the calories to gram for each nutrient. So what are we going to do? How are we going to convert these? So if you take a second and want to convert, how many grams is 1 calorie of carbohydrate? How many calories would 1 gram of protein be? How many calories are going to be 10 grams of carbohydrate? You'll notice that the answers will be the same for each of these. If you look on the right-hand column, we're converting from calories to grams. So if we have 12 calories of carbohydrate, how many grams would that be? If we have 36 grams of protein, if we had 36 calories of protein, how many grams would that be? So take a second and think through the answers to each of these. All right, so here are your answers. Hopefully you came up with these. So if we look on the left-hand column, what you'll see is that 1 gram for protein or for carbohydrate gives us 4 calories. 10 grams will give us 40 calories. 25 grams will give us 100 calories. 50 grams will give us 200 calories. And 100 grams will give us 400 calories. So all we're doing here is simply using the conversion that we have 4 calories for every gram for carbohydrate and protein. So this is the same answer that you would get if we were converting carbohydrate or protein. If we move to the right-hand column, you're going to see that we're going to go the opposite way. So to take 12 calories of carbohydrate, we divide that by 4 because we have 4 calories for every gram, and we will get 3 grams. 36 calories divided by 4 gives us 9 grams. 100 calories divided by 4 gives us 25 grams, and down the list. So you can see that this seems simple, but it's important to understand when we start looking at the math problems that we can use associated with these values. If you do the same thing for fat, you can see that the process is exactly the same. With one exception, we're going to use the conversion of 9 because we have 9 calories for every gram associated with fat. So in the left-hand column, with 1 gram of fat times 9 calories per gram equals 9 calories. 10 grams equals 90 calories. 25 grams equals 225 calories. 50 grams equals 450 calories. 100 grams equals 9 calories. On the right-hand column, you can see the same thing. So all we're doing again is dividing by 9 to give us our answer. So 12 calories of fat is approximately 1.5 grams. 36 calories of fat equals 4 grams. 100 calories, approximately 11, and I've done some rounding on these numbers to keep the math simple here. But you can see, again, the same thing that we did with carbohydrate and protein, just with the conversion of 9, because for every gram of fat, we have 9 calories. Okay, so let's do a couple of practice problems here. So remember that the recommendations for protein include 10 to 35% of our total calories in a day. The RDA, which we haven't mentioned yet, but the RDA for protein is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So we're going to need to know what our body weight is in pounds and then be able to convert that to kilograms. So again, the RDA is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So here's a question. How much protein do you need per day based on body weight? Let's say that you're a 200-pound individual. To convert pounds to kilograms, we're going to divide by 2.2. That's going to give us roughly 90 to 91 kilograms. And then to keep the math simple, let's take that number and say that it's 90. So 90 kilograms times 0.8 is going to give us 72 grams. So you can do that on your own. So take your body weight in pounds, divide it by 2.2, and then multiply it by 0.8, or the RDA, to get how much protein you need in a day. Remember, that recommendation is for the average individual. We will talk about the sport nutrition recommendation toward the end of this presentation. Here's another question. How many grams of protein in a range do you need if you consume 2,525 calories per day based on that percentage or the AMDR? So let's work through that problem. Okay, so the first step that we have to do is that we know the AMDR for protein is 10% to 35%. So what we want to do is use the low end of the range, 10%, and then the high end of the range, 35%. So we take the total number of calories that we said we consume in a day, 2,525 calories, and multiply that by 10%, giving us 253 calories. Again, I've rounded here. And then all that we do to get the answer in grams is convert 253 calories of protein into grams. And you'll remember that the way we do that is to divide by 4 because we have 4 calories per gram. 253 calories of protein divided by 4, that gives us 63 grams of protein. So the answer for how many grams of protein we need from 10%, or the bottom range of the AMDR, is 63 grams of protein. We repeat the same step using the high end of the range. So 2,525 calories times 35% gives us 883 calories of protein. 883 calories of protein converted to grams, so we divide by 4, gives us 220 grams of protein. So the answer for the range for the previous question, how many grams of protein do you need if you consume 2,525 calories using the AMDR, is 63 grams, that represents 10%, and 220 grams, which represents 35%. For strength power athletes, the range for protein intake is 1.2 to 2.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. So the RDA was 0.8 grams. The recommendation of sports nutrition is 1.2 to 2.0. Generally, what you will see is that the lower end of the range, 1.2 to 1.5, is recommended for athletes that are more endurance-based, compared to a recommendation of 1.5 to 2.0 for your strength power athletes. But overall, this is the total recommendation for athletes that you will see, 1.2 to 2.0. All right, so let's do another practice problem. John plays football and is 6'5" and weighs 250 pounds. How much protein should he consume based on a recommendation of 1.2, 1.5, and 1.8 grams of protein per day? How many calories would this be? If he consumes 3,500 total calories a day, what percentage of his total calories is coming from protein? So what do we need to know here? We know that his body weight is 250 pounds. We know that we want to use these recommendations of 1.2, 1.5, and 1.8. And we know that he's going to consume 3,500 total calories in a day. We do not need his height. That information is irrelevant in terms of protein recommendations. So where do we start with this problem? Well, let's take a look. So the first thing that we know is that he weighs 250 pounds, but the protein recommendations are in grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So the first step that we need to do is we take 250 pounds, we divide that by 2.2 to get 114 kilograms. So his kilogram body weight is 114, and that's the number that we will use for our recommendations. So then the next step is we take that body weight and we multiply it by the recommendation that we're given. So the first recommendation that we're given is 1.2. So his body weight, 114 kilograms, times 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight equals 137 grams of protein. So if John is shooting for 1.2 grams of protein as a recommendation, he should be consuming approximately 137 grams of protein in a day. The second question was, how many calories is that? So all we're going to do is convert this gram number of protein to a calorie number of protein. So to get the calories, we take 137 grams, multiply by 4, again because we have for every 1 gram, we have 4 calories, and that's going to give us 548 calories of protein. The second question asks for what percentage that would be. So we take his total number of calories, that came from the problem, 3,500. We take the protein calories that we got above, 548, and we divide those two to get 16%. So what you're going to notice is that at 1.2, he still falls within the AMDR recommendation of 10 to 35%. So I think a lot of times what we think is that the AMDR recommendation is low for an athlete, but in this example you can see that even at 1.2 grams per kilogram, he's still at 16% based on a 3,500 calorie daily intake. Okay, here are the answers using 1.5 and 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So what I would encourage you to do is walk through and see if you can do each of these recommendations. So take the same problem that we looked at with John, who's 6'5" and 250 pounds, and go through and see if you can come up with these same answers. So at a recommendation of protein of 1.5, we get 171 grams of protein, multiply that by 4 to get 684 calories of protein, and then we can divide that by 3,500 to get 20%. For 1.8, again, we take his body weight in kilograms, multiply it by 1.8 to get 205 grams of protein. 205 grams of protein multiplied by 4 will give us 821 calories. 821 calories of 3,500 calories total will give us 23%. So again, you can see that both of those percentages based on 3,500 calories and 1.5 and 1.8 still fall within the AMDR range of 10 to 35% of his total calories. If you have questions on those, feel free to send me an email and I will help you walk through those steps again. On the CEU quiz for this course, you will see some practice questions related to the material below. If you would like additional information, please feel free to contact me at fitnessforprofessionals@gmail.com. Okay, as we move into the sport nutrition recommendations, what I want to keep in mind is that we have different recommendations that we can take a look at. So for example, with carbohydrates, we have daily needs. So how many carbohydrates should we have over the course of an entire day? And then we have fueling needs for carbohydrate. So what amount of carbohydrate do we need before exercise, after exercise, and during exercise? So when we look at fueling needs, we're talking about really an acute period of time, generally before, during, or after exercise, compared to our daily need, which we think about throughout a 24-hour time period. With protein, again, we have that gram per kilogram recommendation, similar to what we just took a look at. So again, be reminded that the sport nutrition recommendation for protein is 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight to 2.0. So 1.2 to 2.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. We also had that distribution range, so we had the 10 to 35%. With athletes, you're generally going to use the gram per kilogram daily number. However, I just wanted to point out that generally that number does still fall within the AMDR range. Moving to fat or lipid, generally when you're planning a diet for an athlete, the fat calories kind of fill in the gap of what is left, but we still will use an AMDR range to make sure that we're in a healthy range. And we'll walk through some of that a little bit more specifically. Okay, let's take a look at carbohydrate recommendations prior to exercise. So there's a couple of recommendations that we can look at as things get closer to training or competition. Now, one thing I want to tell you is to just be aware that training and competition is not necessarily the start of our game or our match or our competition, but this time period is reflective of the time that we will start warming up for that game or competition. So let's think about this. If we have a game that starts at 7 p.m., we may start warming up for that at 5:30 or 6 o'clock. So maybe an hour and a half prior to that. So this recommendation, let's just say that we have a game that starts at 7 and we start our pregame preparations at roughly 6 p.m., an hour before. This 3 to 4 hour window would start 3 to 4 hours prior to that 6 p.m. Warm-up time frame. Okay, keep that in mind. So when we're looking at 3 to 4 hours before our game or our competition, we want to focus on foods that are balanced, that are moderate to high in carbohydrate, and that are easy to digest. So we don't really want foods that are high in fat or high in fiber in that meal. We're really looking for foods that are low in fat and low in fiber. More specifically, we can follow this recommendation. 3 hours prior to, again, that kind of starting time period for our game or competition, we want to consume 3 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. 2 hours before, we want to consume 2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. And 1 hour before our competition, we want to consume 1 gram of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. So again, if we're a 90 kilogram athlete, we're looking at consuming approximately 90 grams of carbohydrates prior to 1 hour prior to the start of our training or competition. So these recommendations are nice because they're pretty easy to remember. 3 hours before equals 3 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram. 2 hours before equals 2 grams of carbohydrate, and 1 hour before equals 1 gram of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. Really, and then we want to look at one more. So immediately before, within 1 hour. So what I would encourage you is that this is really different and individualized based on the athlete. So some athletes, maybe this becomes 30 minutes before. Some athletes, maybe this is 15 minutes before. It really is going to depend on the athlete. So what I would encourage you to do if you're working with athletes is to try some, to test some of these, to pilot some of these in some different time frames and different amounts, just with a practice session. So pick maybe a 15-minute window and a certain food 15 minutes before, try that. Maybe try something else and see how the athlete feels and responds. And that'll give you an idea of how to better prepare for training or competition. So within that 1 hour window, we're generally looking at about 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate. So again, low volume, something that's easy to digest, and maybe it's liquids at this point in time. But again, definitely low in fat, if any fat, low in fiber, if any fiber, and then low in protein, again, if any protein. If we're going for a beverage, we can probably get away with this without any fiber. If we're looking at something simple, food-wise, maybe it's a granola bar or some pretzels or something like that. Again, it's going to have a little bit maybe of these other nutrients, but generally it's going to be in this 30 to 60 gram range for carbohydrate. So again, I would encourage you to test that, and as well as the amounts. And some of that's going to depend on the athlete. It's going to be very different if we're talking about a soccer match versus maybe football or track and field, something like that. So you've got to test these with your athletes to see what will work. Okay, our next time period is during exercise. And there are several recommendations that you may see for this. The first recommendation is that during exercise, an athlete may use 1.0 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. So 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. Another recommendation that you may see is that 1 gram of carbohydrate per minute can be oxidized with moderate intensity exercise. So if you were going to exercise at a moderate to high intensity for, say, 60 minutes, then your body can oxidize approximately 1 gram of carbohydrate per minute. So you may be looking at close to 60 grams of carbohydrate. Now, again, this may be difficult based on the nature of the sport. So we may not be able to consume, during, but maybe this is something at halftime we can use to replenish or at the end of a quarter. Another recommendation that you see, and kind of the summary, would be 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate during moderate intensity exercise. Again, this is probably going to be in liquid form, but it may be in food form as well. And again, I encourage you to pilot these things to see what works best for you or your athlete. Another note here is training for less than 45 minutes may not require carbohydrate intake at all. So if we're following a 45-minute kind of training session or low intensity workout, we probably want to consider not using carbohydrate at all. But again, it will depend on the part of the season you're in and if we're trying to gain weight or lose weight or maintain weight. But just make a note here that training less than 45 minutes per day may not require carbohydrate intake. Okay, when we think about after or post training, so a couple things to keep in mind is one, it will depend on the nature of the event. So if we are competing in, say, a tournament setting where we have multiple events occurring in short recovery periods, the recovery time is more important. So it's going to be important to maximize that recovery time when we're in a tournament setting, for example, and we have a quick turnaround. So if we have back-to-back games, so maybe we have a game on Thursday night and a game on Friday night, that's going to be a short recovery time. So we're going to need to optimize that rapid phase of recovery and replenish glycogen. It's going to be a little bit less important if we have events that allow for longer periods in between. So for example, if we have a high school football player, they play a game on Friday evening and they won't practice again until Monday afternoon, it becomes less important to maximize that recovery time period because what you'll see at this last point is that our body will replenish glycogen stores. Remember, glycogen is that stored carbohydrate, stored glucose that our body uses for physical activity and exercise. It will replete that in approximately 24 hours, and here's the key, if adequate carbohydrates are consumed. So if we're consuming adequate carbohydrates and we have a longer turnaround between the next, training session or event, it's not necessarily important to maximize that first early phase of recovery. However, I will recommend that if you're in season, if you're in a hard training phase, that you do that. But know that if we do have more than 24 hours between, okay, and we consume adequate carbohydrates, the body will replete glycogen on its own with adequate carbohydrate consumption. Okay, when we look at replenishing glycogen, and you can see that if we want to maximize that in that early phase after training or competition, the recommendation is 1.0 to 1.5, that would be grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per hour. Okay, so you're looking at roughly half your body weight if you want to use that for a guide, but the more precise recommendation is 1.0 to 1.5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per hour. So again, since we've used the example of our 90 kilogram athlete, they want to consume approximately 90 grams of carbohydrate, so 90 times 1, 90 times 1.5, so we're looking at approximately 135. So that athlete would consume 90 to 135 grams of carbohydrate in an hour, okay, based on body weight. And what we want to do is we want to do that every 2 to 3 hours, probably in about 2 to 3 increments so that we fully replenish glycogen. Moving on to sport nutrition recommendations for protein. Again, you can see that this is a review. We've said the AMDR for protein is 10 to 35%. So that's 10 to 35% of our total calories in a day. The RDA for protein is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And then we moved into the sport nutrition recommendation. So we said the daily recommendation for an athlete is 1.2 to 2.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Post-exercise or post-training, the acute recommendation there is 20 to 30 grams of protein. So 20 to 30 grams of protein immediately after training. And a lot of times we think about this as strength training or resistance training, but any exercise that is going to be the intensity to break down the muscle, we want to consume 20 to 30 grams of protein immediately following. So here are my final thoughts on the sport nutrition recommendations. Number one, make recommendations practical. When you're giving these recommendations to an athlete, think about how they can translate that information into something useful. For example, consider things like, can they keep food or beverages refrigerated? Or can you come up with food or beverages that don't need to be refrigerated? So we used a granola bar, for example. You can see that that would be practical for an athlete compared to maybe something like that has to be heated or cooled. So keep recommendations simple, keep them practical for your athlete. Second point, especially when we think about kind of our traditional pregame meals, be mindful of an athlete's tradition and preferences. So try to work in something that the athlete feels comfortable with, that the athlete likes to eat or enjoys eating or drinking, flavors, textures, all of those things are important to keep in mind when we're making these recommendations. So be mindful of that athlete's tradition or preferences. Now, some of these may have to be worked on. So again, we don't want to consume something an hour before that's high in fat or high in fiber. So we may have to modify and work with the athlete a little bit on these things. But do be mindful when we're making that initial recommendations of their traditions and of the preferences. And the third point and last point is to use practice for practice. I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, but we don't want to try something new out on game days. So just like we practice plays, we practice basketball plays, we practice football plays, and we do that in practice. So we also want to focus on our sport nutrition recommendations in practice. So when it's time for the game, we know what we're doing. So again, that would be things to consider such as amounts of food. So are we better with 30 grams of carbohydrate? Are we better with 60 grams of carbohydrate? Do we feel sluggish if we do it too close to the game? Do we feel too hungry if we do it too early before? So we have to tweak those things, but that's what practice is for. So when you have a practice session, put in some of those recommendations and then make some notes about how you feel, how your athlete felt, so you can go back to those and make modifications from them until you can get the optimal performance from the athlete. I'd love it if you follow me on social media. You can see that the Instagram is TheFitness4Pros, and you can also locate me on Twitter at Fitness4Pros. Thank you for joining me today. Again, my name is Paul Moore. What you want to do is go through the questions now that are listed underneath this presentation. Make sure you answer those and go through the additional presentations and answer those questions. And once you submit that, I will return to you your CEU certificate for this module. Thank you today for joining me for Fitness for Professionals for this NSCA approved CEU module on sports nutrition.